Hey, last night it looks like the IDF may have joined the Palestinian terror battle from Jenin, um, but the left continues its increasingly violent anti-government protests. Robert Mailey is out amidst a cloud of suspicion as the Biden administration's chief negotiator with Iran, but it looks like the Iran policy marches on, and the Biden administration signals something in relation to the Abraham Accords, but what is it? I'll get into that and much more in my quick take. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome to another quick take with Carolyn Glick. Hi, I'm Carolyn Glick from the Carolyn Glick Show, and I just want to go over the top news that's been hitting Israel over the past several days. So first of all, on Sunday night, very late, the IDF began a coordinated assault against Jenin refugee camp in the city of Jenin. Refugee camp sounds very dangerous and sad, but really the refugee camp in Jenin is just a neighborhood in the city that happens to be operated by the UN. At any rate, it's long served as kind of a hotbed of terrorism inside of Jenin, and really the terror capital of northern Samaria. I just wrote an article that's up on JNS now about what the potential of the battle is. Basically, that we have to look at this as a tactical operation on the side of the IDF. All they want to do is try to stop enabling terrorists to have free reign in the refugee camp, because it works out that in September of 2021, the Central Command Commander Yehuda Fuchs ordered IDF forces to stand down in Jenin, despite the fact that it was the epicenter of a terrorist assault that began in March of 2021. But all the same, working with then Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who appointed him, Fuchs, fresh off of the job of attaché, military attaché at the Israeli embassy in Washington, came back to Israel and said, well, the IDF has to stop its operations in Jenin because that'll calm the situation and enable the Palestinian Authority to take over control of the city. In the event the Palestinian Authority, to the extent it's in control in conjunction with the terror forces that are operating in the town. Last week, Fatah, the command unit of the PLO that controls the Palestinian Authority, bragged on its own media outlets that its forces, including U.S.-trained Palestinian security forces, have carried out 2/3 of the terrorist attacks against Israel. So they're not fighting terrorism, they're participating in terrorism and taking credit for terrorism carried out against Israelis. And really in Jenin, what you've had for a long time is this kind of combined operations center where, and this is going back decades, where Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and Fatah forces all fight together. And if you want to make a distinction between Fatah and the Palestinian Authority security services, you can, but they're all in it together. They all operate together. Iran has bragged that they're very involved in what's happening in Samaria, and that's true. They're funneling money into Jenin and into Shechem, into Nablus, and in other places in Samaria, funding terrorism and directing a lot of the terrorist operations as well from Tehran and from Beirut. But be that as it may, the current operation is just to try to stop the free-for-all in Jenin refugee camp, because as a result of Fuchs's order and the policies, the stand-down policies of the Bennett, Gantz, Lapid government, all of these terrorist groups have managed to build a pretty astounding infrastructure of terrorism. We've had 4 or 5 rocket attempts emanating from Jenin, and they're primitive rockets to be sure, but that's how the Gaza missile industry started. And today, from Gaza, the missiles that are shot off by Hamas and Islamic Jihad are capable of reaching nearly all of Israeli territory, and they pose a strategic threat that right now Israel is able to handle with the Iron Dome security umbrella, the anti-missile shield, but that's not going to work if we're shot at from Gaza, from Judea and Samaria, and very potentially from Lebanon as well. It's just not going to be sufficient. We don't have sufficient quantities of anti-missile missiles, first and foremost. We also don't have enough batteries. At any rate, so that's a looming strategic threat, and at least we'll be able to retard it significantly with this operation. The problem is that the potential of this operation is limited because Fuchs and apparently IDF Chief of General Staff Herzl Levy, Ronen Bar, the head of the Shabak, the Shin Bet, don't see the strategic realities on the ground. There was just an article published in Hakol Yehudi news service where a very top officer in Central Command insisted that the Palestinian Authority isn't Israel's enemy and that they oppose terrorism. This is completely and fundamentally wrong on the basis of the facts, but it really exposed the ideological worldview that's directing the operational logic, such as it is of the Central Command, and its refusal to take any concerted action against the Palestinian terrorists or limit them. And they specifically claimed that this operation is not directed against the Palestinian Authority. So I think that the operation has the potential of diminishing levels of operations. I detail those operations in the article that I wrote that you should look at. But basically, Israeli civilians are living in a shooting gallery right now because of the level of violence that's directed against them every day. I mean, you have hundreds of stoning attacks at Israeli vehicles every day. You have some of it as well in Judea, particularly in the South Hebron Hills. But it's nothing like what you're seeing in the Benjamin region and in the Samaria and in northern Samaria. And that's because of the free-for-all for terrorists in that area of Samaria and in the Benjamin region. So hundreds of stoning attacks. In May, according to the Shin Bet, you had 113, I think, Molotov cocktail attacks at vehicles, 11 shooting attacks, and I think 35 pipe bomb attacks. So this is a level of terrorism that's really it's made life unmanageable. And rather than really taking action against the Palestinians, the IDF and particularly Central Command has implemented a strategy that is focused on quelling vigilantism among Israelis who are being victimized by this terrorism, and they're working really hand in glove in a weird way with the Biden administration, both the IDF and the Biden administration castigating what they refer to as settler violence. When it's very important to note that just in the last year, 0 Palestinians have been killed by Israelis, and 29 Israelis have been killed by Palestinians. Most lately, 4 were massacred at a restaurant a week and a half ago in LE. But you look at the kind of deformation of reality, the distortion of reality that's being portrayed by the IDF, and the IDF is not really taking any concerted action to protect Israeli Jews on the highways in the region, and really allowing them to just be sitting ducks in their cars as they drive along the roads, which is really stunning. And so they're left without defenses. And then, occasionally you have acts of vigilante violence like you had last Saturday. So rather than saying, okay, we're going to stop this by coming in and actually protecting these people, instead you have the IDF and you have the police and you have the Shabak. They just announced the day before this operation on Sunday, it was reported in Channel 11 in Israel, that they're forming a joint unit just to fight Jewish vigilantes in Samaria. So they took. So now we have this tactical operation in Jenin. The IDF is trying to make it so low key that initially they said that it was called House and Garden, and they said no, there's no name for this operation. It's not a big deal. We don't even want to give it an operation. So they're not giving it an operation. And again, the impact of this will be tactical. It might be able to take out the nascent missile industry that they're developing there. It may be able to diminish levels of attacks by killing or arresting a significant number of terrorists. But the basic realities on the ground are not going to get better because the IDF refuses to recognize those realities. And so we moved from that. While this was happening, while you had Special Forces brigade going into Jenin this morning, you had, a couple of hundred leftist anarchists led by bored former retired generals taking over, blocking the entrances to Israel's main port in Haifa. They put down barbed wire on the ground to block trucks and cars from entering into the port with loudspeakers, and they're democracy, while they're blocking traffic and they're preventing the operation of Israel's largest port. Aside from that, I was on Twitter this morning and I was looking at the Twitter feed of one of the heads of these riots, and so he showed footage of him and his comrades going and assaulting, attacking, intimidating government ministers. They went after Uribe Levine, the justice minister. They cornered him in a restaurant in Modi'in when he was having dinner with his wife and started screaming at him. It was actually kind of dangerous. They followed him out to his car and they harassed him. They were screaming at him the whole time. They went after Simcha Rothman, who was on the show. He's the chairman of the Knesset's Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee that's undertaking all of the judicial reforms and passing it through the legislative process. So he was apparently away at the seaside community of Bat Galim by Haifa the other day, and they followed him there. They followed Transportation Minister Miri Regev on a trip to Georgia. They were waiting outside of her hotel, apparently, to harass her. And just on and on and on. Moshe Sada, a member of Knesset, former senior justice ministry official who went into politics to fight the corruption in the justice ministry, and particularly in the police investigations unit, which is a unit it's a CID, I guess. They investigate policemen, and it's become completely corrupted by the justice ministry and the attorney general, who use it as a political weapon. Anyway, so he quit government service and went into politics to try to fight them from the Knesset, and so they've been harassing him everywhere he goes. And on and on. Danny Danon, the former UN ambassador, is now a member of Knesset with Likud. They stood outside his house in Ra'anana. And then this afternoon, after we tape, there's supposed to be a mass protest / rally / interruption of service at Ben Gurion International Airport beginning at 5:30 in the afternoon. And just to give you a sense of the timing, I mean, this is now July 3rd that I'm taping this show. Summer vacation for the kids started last week. And so you have families who want to go abroad for vacation now. So they're expecting, I think it's 50,000 or over 100,000 Israelis to pass through Ben Gurion Airport and tourists to come into Israel today at between 5:30 and 8, when they said that they're going to be holding their mob violent protests. They're going to be planes taking off and landing, carrying 30,000 people. So they're going to interrupt that traffic. They were giving orders to the public. You have to leave 4 hours before your flight. You should take the train. We're not going to interrupt train traffic, but if you try to take your private car, you're not going to make it to the airport. So now we've warned you, and therefore, just do what we tell you and you'll be fine. And this is crazy, right? Because in Haifa, the organizers were bragging that no one had been arrested. I mean, this is an illegal act of political violence against Israel's largest port and its operators and its clients. They're blocking shipping traffic in and out of Israel, and nobody was arrested. We don't know what's going to happen in the airports while I'm talking about this, but this is just sort of this has become the modus operandi of the law enforcement community under orders from Attorney General Gali Baharav-Miara, who is the appointee of the previous government, and she's been using all of her power to try to subvert the existing government, the current government, the Netanyahu government. And so, we've really never experienced anything like this before, but that's what we're experiencing now. Netanyahu had a meeting last week with some of his top ministers and Gali Baharav-Miara and the state prosecutor and all of their senior people. He's saying, what's going on? We have to have law enforcement against everybody, towards everybody. That's what a rule of law is. And Godly Barav Miara said, well, in some instances, you're allowed to block traffic. I mean, she said this without blinking. She said this without blushing. So what they're saying is there's no longer a rule of law in Israel. They're saying it openly and proudly. We have 2 rules of law in Israel, or 3, if you will. There's 1 rule of law for leftists, and that means that they're allowed to do whatever they want. There's another rule of law for Arabs and Druze, which is you're basically allowed to do whatever you want so long as you don't kill anybody. And then there's a 3rd rule of law for Likud voters, for ultra-Orthodox Jews, for Jews who live in Judea and Samaria who are religious, and for them, they are guilty before they're proven until they're proven innocent. They just had Gallant, who's really just working as a servant of the general staff of the army. He just signed administrative detention orders for 4 Israelis. Why did he put them under detention for 6 months? They're going to be in jail with no charges against them because a magistrate's judge, a court judge, who they saw after they were originally arrested, apparently for rioting, like in the Palestinian village on Shabbat last week, said there's no evidence to keep them behind bars, so she released them, and then the army picked them up anyway and slapped them into administrative detention. So that's that. So, Haredim are beaten every time that they try to interrupt traffic in Jerusalem or protest in any way, whatever. So we have 3 rules of law, and the people who are in charge of law enforcement in Israel know what they are, know how to behave towards different populations, and they say that any attempt to reform the judicial system or the legal system in Israel is an act of dictatorship. So, okay, we get it. And in the meantime, the Knesset, Simcha Rothman's committee, is about to pass through into the plenary session for a vote one portion of the judicial reform package, which is to eliminate or limit what's called the Reasonableness clause. And we've talked about this as where judges have given themselves the ability to overturn every government decision and law, not on the basis of law, but on the basis of what they term reasonableness. The reasonableness, distinction. So they get to decide, obviously subjectively based on their own ideological convictions or mood, whether a government action like appointing Shas leader Aryeh Deri to serve as a minister in the Netanyahu government is reasonable or unreasonable. They decide it's unreasonable. Deri, who is, the head of a party that got 450,000 or so Israelis to vote for them, he's not allowed to he's not allowed to serve in the government. So essentially, Shas voters were just disenfranchised because the guy that they voted for at the head of the list that they supported is banned from serving in the government. That the judges of the Supreme Court decided was reasonable because they said that they know best. So that's one thing. And then this is all happening against the backdrop of the collapse of the charges against Netanyahu. We talked about this at length last week in the Carolyn Glick show with Professor Avi Bell. If you haven't seen it, you should watch this segment. But what's happening now is the judges said, look, the bribery charge, it's collapsed. I mean, you haven't proved anything. The defense doesn't even really have to make a defense because you as a prosecution haven't made your case, so they have nothing to argue. But at any rate, so the judges said that, and that leaves them with their fake breach of trust charges that are just phony baloney. And one of them is falling apart now with testimony being taken in England. And the other 2 are based on the bribery charge. So if that's gone, they're gone. So we're looking towards an acquittal, which is freaking the left out completely. So how are they handling this? Well, while they're opposing judicial reform because they say that the most important thing is judicial independence, they're attacking the judges in who are adjudicating Netanyahu's criminal case because they're independent, because they're not supposed to be, they're not supposed to be saying that he's not guilty because that's just going against the script. You're not allowed to do that. So they're waging this campaign of intimidation against the judges. On Friday night, the tribal update of Channel 12 News, which is like the left's kind of campfire ground where they have a powwow. So everybody just basically gang raped the judges. They had on Meet the Press, they had the former state prosecutor, Moshe Lador, who's kind of a left-wing radical. He got up and he said that the judge's decision or notification that the bribery charges collapsed was a terrorist assault against the justice system. Why does he say that? Because he wants Netanyahu convicted of bribery, even though there is no bribery crime and the case itself has collapsed. So that's what's happening with them. And now we're just going to move on to international affairs. So I want to talk for a second about Iran and then another second about the Abraham Accords, and then we'll be done. So on Iran, you guys probably heard that the special envoy for negotiations with Iran, Robert Mailey, was put on unpaid leave after his security clearance was apparently revoked. And what's interesting about that is that the State Department hid this fact from Congress. And so Mike McCall, the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, is demanding an explanation for what happened. Mailey apparently disappeared from view already in May, and nobody informed Congress. And it was only when reporters started asking questions last week that Mailey said that he had been put on leave because problems with his security clearance, and then the State Department clarified that it's unpaid leave. But before any of that, nobody knew that the guy was out. We did know that Brett McGurk was the White House Middle East coordinator, was in Oman conducting the negotiations with Iran, but we didn't know anything about Mailey being suspended. So that's kind of notable. But we have to make clear that the fact that Mailey is gone doesn't indicate a change in U.S. policy regarding America's desire to realign itself towards Iran and away from Israel and at Israel's expense. We see that going on. The negotiations that McGurk has been carrying out are towards a deal where Iran would be allowed to keep its stockpile of enriched uranium, which, according to the United States, leaves it as a threshold nuclear state. They say that they have sufficient quantities of enriched uranium in order to build 7 bombs. Last week, I talked about it on my quick take. You had Cyprus and Greece announcing terror plots by Iran on their soil. And you also had the Swedish and the German and the Dutch intelligence services with intelligence reports that were published by Memory showing that Iran is trying to acquire the components of nuclear weapons through dual-use technologies in Europe. So they're trying to build a bomb. They have enough enriched uranium, and the Americans are fine with that. They want to cut a deal with the Iranians that would leave them in possession of all that enriched uranium and end what little is left of the enforcement regime instituted by the Trump administration. Just to give you a sense of how lax U.S. enforcement has been just on the oil front. So I read reports from Iran International in 2019 and 2020 when Trump was in office, and they were applying the maximum pressure campaign and the economic sanctions. Iran oil exports went down to 250,000 barrels a day. Today, they're up to 1.5 million. And ostensibly, the sanctions haven't been lifted. So this is what we've seen with the Biden administration. So with Mailey, without Mailey, you'll have the same thing. And the last thing that I want to talk about is that Blinken, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, announced that he was appointing Dan Shapiro, the Obama's ambassador to Israel. Dan Shapiro, who never left Israel and served the entire time, lived here the whole time while Trump was president, working to subvert Trump's policies, and his successor, David Friedman. He got a job at Israel's premier security think tank, which has been a nice place, a welcoming place for all the former generals who are now on the streets inciting against the government. So it's called INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. Dan Shapiro worked there, and he gave all of these interviews to Israeli television saying how terrible the Trump administration's policies in Israel were to undermine their credibility. And now he's just been appointed a special envoy for the Abraham Accords. So does that mean that the Americans want to expand the Abraham Accords, the peace treaties that Trump and Netanyahu sealed between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco? No, it doesn't seem so. It's been a lot of talk. Is America going to mediate peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia? So the same time, I think that he announced his appointment of Shapiro, Tony Blinken last Wednesday gave a speech before the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, where he insisted that Israel's operations in Judea and Samaria have tanked his efforts to bring peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So Israel's to blame for his failure to bring peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Never mind that the Biden administration has rejected Saudi Arabia's conditions for peace with Israel, which are all American security guarantees and American cooperation with nuclear program for Saudi Arabia. All of that the U.S. has rejected, but Israel is at fault because of our operations in Judea and Samaria. So there were reports yesterday, Sunday, I think, that said, Saudi Arabia is now saying that their condition for peace with Israel is that Israel withdraw from Judea and Samaria. To that, we can all just say, look, we love you guys, the Saudis. You've been terrific partners for us for the past 8 years, but, we're happy with where our relations are now, under the table, barely visible, maybe sometimes visible, but not official. That's fine, because if you want us to give peace to these, give pieces of our land to these terrorists who are shooting us down and developing missiles in Judea and Samaria, tough. So how is the government supposed to handle all of this? Well, I think the truth is, let me just get a little bit of water. I think the truth is that what we're seeing is that the government, after the initial shock of the left-wing violence for the first 3 months of its tenure, from like January to March, and then they went to the president's office to chill things down, I think that the government has been learning how to cope with this really untenable situation that we're seeing in all quarters, from the army subverting the government in Judea and Samaria. And again, look at my articles. I don't want to go through all the details, but Fuchs has really been taking action, the commanding general of the Central Command, to undermine the government's policies, its key policies in northern Samaria. So read the article. But and then the leftist revolt, the legal, the law enforcement arms, triple rule of law for depending on what your political position is. And all of the rest of it. So the government has been facing this situation, and I think that they're slowly moving forward in a plodding way, in a way that most of their voters find frustrating and demoralizing in some senses. But I think that the operation in Jenin will give some improvement to the security situation on the ground without doing what the army wants, which is to give away the store to the Palestinian Authority. That's important. The reform is moving forward slowly, albeit, but it is moving forward ploddingly, albeit. But again, it's not stopping. The reasonableness clause is said to be significantly curtailed, or their right to use the reasonableness clause is not going to be outlawed, but it's going to be significantly cut back. And then they have other legislation that they're working on, including the Judicial Selection Committee and other things. So this is important. And then vis-a-vis Iran and the United States, look, I think I gave a Twitter space talk to actually a lot of Iranians last night, which was interesting. And they were saying, well, how is Israel going to attack Iran's nuclear installations if the U.S. isn't giving refuelers? And I think that, what we're seeing is an revelation of Israeli capabilities on the ground in Iran that may actually make the issue of how many F-35s do we have. For some reason, we decide we want another squadron, not clear, but whatever. Almost unimportant, because I don't know if you guys saw it. It was pretty exciting. There was this report on Sunday, I guess it was, or Thursday, that regarding the terrorist plot in Cyprus, where they were planning on going after Israeli targets. So Israel had very precise intelligence on the cell and what it was doing. And as a result, Cypriot authorities were able to arrest everybody except the ringleader, who managed to go back to Iran. And then this guy was arrested by Mossad operatives in Iran. And from Iran, he gave a videotaped confession of the entire plot. So most important aspect of that videotaped confession and everything else was that Israel was exposing vast capabilities on the ground in Iran. So my friend and mentor, Michael Adine in Washington, always used to say about the prospect of attacking Iran's nuclear installations, there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to handle the issue of Iran's nuclear installations, and I think that they aren't all contingent on the United States giving Israel mid-air refueling planes. So, I think it's about slowly rebuilding, slowly moving forward, and then rising. And I'll end with just a little sort of interpretation of the last Torah portion we read last Saturday, which was Balak, and it's about if you know the story from the book of Numbers, it's a priest who the king of Moab, Balak, went to. His name was Balaam, and asked him to curse the children of Israel in the desert because he was afraid that they were going to attack him and everything like that. So, and then God took over, threatened Balaam and said, you have to say exactly what I tell you to say. So instead of cursing Israel, on 3 different occasions, he blessed them. And throughout the portion, there's this duality. He refers to Balaam does Israel as Israel on the one hand and Jacob on the other. Those are the 2 names of Abraham's grandson Jacob. It's Jacob and then Israel. And the duality is that Jacob says, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. So how beautiful are your tents, how good are your tents, Jacob, and your halls, Israel. And so the idea is that, there are 2 kind of modes of operation. One is to be crouched down and let the rain pass over you and build yourself a good shelter of a tent. And that's sort of the Jacob. And then the Israels, you go forth and you have these beautiful halls of power or whatever. And so I think that what we're seeing now with the government is initially they thought that they could go out into the hall. Then they realized they had to crouch back into the tent. And now they're slowly moving forward, and hopefully, we'll be able to see in a matter of months or perhaps at the end of this government's term, I don't know, but that we'll see in retrospect that there was a rhyme or reason to what we're seeing now, because the left is clearly out of control, the IDF is out of control, and there's a lot of stuff, pointing down at us. The Biden administration is hostile. So we'll have to wait and see. But when I look at the overall picture, I can see reasons to be very hopeful that we're going to move from the tent out into the hall and things are going to work out just fine. So that's my optimistic, sunny perspective today. Have a great week, and we'll see you again next week.